Welcome to part 9 of the series I've been doing in End Times Prophecies. We are now in the middle of the book of Revelation, and there are two big topics I want to cover in this particular lesson. First, we're going to be looking at the Jewish remnant and the two witnesses and just what that's all about. And then we're going to finish the lesson talking about the false prophet, which is the section of scripture that speaks about the mark of the beast. So we're going to wrap up the lesson talking about what those verses mean and what we might be seeing in the future as fulfillment of these particular prophecies. So this is a lesson that's going to fill in more details into that timeline that we've been developing throughout our entire study. So I hope this will answer some questions that you may have, fill in the picture a little bit more, and just continue to prepare you for what is to come. Because as we've been saying all along, we are not supposed to be ignorant of these things. We're supposed to be awake and ready, and we are supposed to remind each other of Jesus' second coming as an encouragement, but also it's supposed to motivate us to stay on purpose, to stay on mission, to speak to people about the gospel and bring them to their own point of salvation and their own relationship with Jesus. Everything I'm going to talk about today, it is not meant to feed into fear. So if you find yourself starting to fret, starting to worry, if you start to feel dread, if there's anything like that that's triggered, I want to invite you to pause and pray into that, because these are not things that are supposed to be points of fear for us. However, we will empathize with the world. We'll even empathize with people we know who right now don't know Jesus, aren't in a steadfast relationship with the Lord, and are vulnerable to being caught up into the deception that we know is coming and the systems that are currently being put into place. That if this is in fact the final iteration of Nimrod rising up and trying to successfully build that city and that tower, until Jesus comes and knocks it all down, that's what we need to be watching for. So whether this is the final iteration or not, we are supposed to be ready for whatever is to come, knowing that we have the ultimate victory in Christ. Whether he is coming to put an end to it or whether he's going to intervene some other way in order to stop things from happening before their time, we can learn from these scriptures and we can learn from the events that are transpiring to help us have a deeper understanding of scripture, to have a deeper sense of preparation. And again, don't be afraid. Instead, be encouraged and motivated to be sharing the gospel, to be sharing your faith, to be giving others that insight into the truth about what's happening in the world around us. Because this series has been so timely. There was no way I could anticipate the events transpiring in our world and how much they align with the prophecies that we see in Scripture, particularly those in Revelation that we are studying right now. So today we're going to start by talking about the Jewish remnant, and we're going to begin in Revelation chapter 12. So I'm going to start with just the first 6 verses of chapter 12 because I believe that this is a shortened version of events from the past to the present and the future that then John elaborates on in the verses that follow. So starting in verse 1, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. We know that's a reference to Jesus. But her child, Jesus, was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years. So I want to point out a couple of things about this passage. First, the woman who is pregnant, who gives birth to the male child who's to rule all the nations, who is caught up to the throne, that is Israel. I know there are people out there who teach what we call replacement theology, who says that this is describing the church. But we did not give birth to Jesus. Jesus gave birth to the church. We did not give birth to Jesus. Israel did. So the woman who has the 12 stars, which would represent the 12 tribes of Israel, that is Israel. The great red dragon, which in a few verses after this, John says is the devil. So this is Satan, that ancient serpent. We'll be reading that verse here shortly. But that's who this is. It is the Satan, the head guy. Now it says he has 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. We heard that same description in our lesson about the beast. And if you read Revelation 13, that's where you'll see the description of the beast, who also has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems. So why does the dragon and the beast look the same? Well, that's because the beast is the offspring of the dragon. And we know from Genesis 3:15 that the seed of the woman, Jesus, will crush the head of the seed of the serpent. The seed of the serpent is the Antichrist. It is the beast. And we know from previous aspects of our study that everything that the Antichrist does, everything the beast does, is because he is empowered by the dragon. So of course, daddy's going to look like son. Okay, so the daddy, the dread dragon, he's got 7 horns and, or 7 heads and 10 horns, just like his son, his offspring, his seed, the beast, the Antichrist. That's why they look the same. Okay. And also where it says his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven. We know stars are often a euphemism for angels. This is the verse where people get the idea that when Satan fell, he took 1/3 of heaven with him, 1/3 of the angels with him. Now, there are some who now push back on that, thinking that this is referring to something else. But I believe when we read the following verses, which give more detail and elaborate upon what we see here, that there's a correspondence between this passage and the dragon and his angels. So I'm more inclined to agree with that historical interpretation that 1/3 of the angels did fall with Satan. Okay. When we look at this passage, I have 2 things underlined. A great sign appeared in heaven, another sign appeared in heaven. This is not something we see John say very often. And I believe that this is a reference to things that were actually happening in the sky, among the stars, in the constellations. And what John is saying is that this has been played out, mapped out before our eyes in the stars, right? And then the verses that follow this then give us insight into what was happening in the unseen realm. So this is what we can see in the heavens. And then he's going to elaborate and even explain some of these symbols and what was happening in the unseen realm, what was happening behind the scenes. And here's what I mean by that. If we look at the night sky, there's a constellation called Virgo, which would be the Virgin, right? Which we know Mary was a virgin, and she's the one who gave birth to Jesus. So that's Virgo. And if you look, it actually looks like a person laying down. Well, when it comes to the dragon, the red dragon, there are a couple of constellations that could potentially fit. I know some people might immediately think of Draco, but Draco's over the North Pole, so that would not fit here. But also in the description of the dragon, it says 7 heads. Well, that's more like Hydra, and Hydra is right next to Virgo. And there is another constellation that sits on Hydra called Crater, which is meant to be a goblet. But if you look, it could also look like a crown, like those diadems that Hydra's supposed to be or that the dragon's supposed to be wearing. Okay. So if we go back to the description, a woman, the Virgo, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. So that's the first sign. Then the second sign is the red dragon with the seven heads, 10 horns, seven diadems. Okay. And he stood before the woman who's about to give birth. So far, so good as far as, okay, well, here's Virgo, and right next to her is Hydra, and Hydra has crater, which kind of looks like a crown on it. Okay. But there's more clues to that passage that are relevant, and it's the fact that she was clothed with the sun. There are moments in which the sun will be in the midst of Virgo, and it'll look like she's wearing the sun. And there's also times where the moon will be at what are the feet of Virgo. But it's a rare thing to see both happening at the same time, the sun in her midst and the moon at her feet. Then you also add in the 12 stars on her head. Well, above her is the constellation Leo, okay, which is the lion, which Jesus is the lion of the tribe of Judah. Well, there's also moments in which Jupiter, who would be considered the king planet, lines up within Leo and ends up making it a constellation of 12 stars. So, what's the moment in which all those things happen? That you have Virgo and Hydra who are always near each other, but you also then have the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet, and Jupiter inside Leo, which then brings 12 stars at her head like a crown. Well, that happened on September 11th, 3 BC. And you can see in the image there, the sun looks like it's clothing her. The moon is at her feet. Jupiter is with Regulus up in Leo. Hydra's right there. This is what it would have looked like, and it would match what John is saying were signs in heaven. And I have a quote here from this website that did the calculations according to what they know about constellations and time. And this is what they said. Jupiter joined Regulus, chief star in the constellation of Leo the Lion, which would mean the royal planet, which is Jupiter, and the royal star, Regulus. Okay. In other places, they'll see king planet and king star. So you have the king planet, the royal planet, the king star, the royal star in Leo the Lion. I mean, that right there, it all points to Jesus. The sun was in Virgo. That's the Virgin constellation. The new moon in the royal constellation Leo. But the moon you can see is at her feet. Okay, so at this time the moon's at her feet though. The first day of the Jewish New Year is Tishri 1. After this first conjunction, Jupiter continued on its normal course in the heavens. Now, in Jerusalem on September 10th, 3 BC, sunset was at 6:19 p.m. and moonset was at 7:40 p.m. Now, according to the Jewish calendar, days were measured sunset to sunset. So because of that, he would have been born on what we consider September 11th, the next day. And it says sometime in that 81-minute span of time between sunset and moonset. Okay, because the sun can't be in her if the sun's not visible, but then the moon needs to be at her feet, right? So between 6:19 p.m. and 7:40 p.m., okay, when the calendar is shifting from September 10th to September 11th, Jesus would have been born sometime in that because that's when this picture would have happened. 81 minutes. So all these factors lining up, they would have only been there for 81 minutes. And so what this person believes is that Jesus was most likely born then at 7 p.m. because God is very exact. He often uses sevens. Seven is completion, it's a divine number. And it's at 7 p.m. that the moon would have been in the midst of her feet. So we say all this because when we look at the passage, he is giving us something beyond just telling us about these events, okay? What he is letting us know, which really aligns with other passages about how God reveals things, in the stars as well as the firmament declares his glory, and that nature reveals things. Okay, so John is saying there's signs in the heavens. Okay, so one, we know that Jesus was born September 11th, 3 BC, within that 81-minute period, most likely at 7 p.m., because God likes sevens. It's the divine number. That's also when the moon would have been in the midst of her feet. And also, Jupiter being with Regulus would have been the star that the Magi then followed, okay, because it would have been so bright. So when we look at all these different factors, right? That's what we're seeing here, is that John is telling us, using the events that happened in the stars to lay out what was going on. That the woman Israel, okay, and we know specifically Mary the virgin, she was pregnant and giving birth. The dragon was there waiting to devour, and we know that he attempted to devour Jesus through Herod, who issued the decree to slaughter all the boys under the age of 2. And Jesus was only spared because God sent Joseph a dream saying, go to Egypt. Okay. So that's when we're looking at these different events that are being described in these first few verses of Revelation 12. But like I said, I think that's kind of like the Cliffs Notes version. It's these just laying out the basics, which isn't unheard of in the way that a lot of portions of the Bible are written. When you read Psalms and Proverbs, when you read the prophets, it's not uncommon for there to be something described in more images or allegory, metaphor, that kind of thing, and then the following verses explain it. We also see Jesus do this in the way that he taught. He would give a parable and then he would explain the parable. That's what I believe is happening here. John is using these events in the sky, what transpired in the constellations, and then he's going to elaborate on it. And he's going to give us more insight into what was happening and what the part that couldn't be seen. Okay. So that's what we're going to pick up. So we know now, okay, so all these things were happening in the constellations. There was something actually happening in the sky, but there was more happening behind the scenes. But we know Israel, Mary specifically, giving birth to Jesus. The dragon is sitting there waiting to devour, right? But Jesus is spared from that. The dragon doesn't get to devour him. Instead, he gets caught up to God, to the throne. And so instead, the woman flees. Okay. And we know that this happens in 70 AD when Rome destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, kills a lot of Jewish people, takes a lot of Jewish people into slavery. There's a lot that flee, and they fled north. A lot of them fled north. And so that's why today we see a lot of Jewish people who actually have a lot of European DNA, is because they all fled north and they ended up settling there for centuries, right? So it's that's part of that story. But then we know that she comes back into the land, right? Israel is formed as a nation in 1948. But this idea that she is to be nourished, that's future. Everything else was past tense, including her, she fled into the wilderness. But it says then that God is preparing a place for her and she is to be nourished for 3.5 years. We're going to see that again in the verses that elaborate. So let's jump back into Revelation 12. So I'm going to be showing these side by side because I want you to see how they actually correspond. Okay. So picking up in verse 7, now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he, the dragon, was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them, the dragon and his angels, in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. That's what I mean by it lining up to his tail swept down a third of the stars and cast them to earth. That's why I do believe that that third of the stars represents angels, because the story lines up, and we know stars are often a euphemism for angels anyway. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. Okay. Now, I want to point that out because we see that there is a relationship between Jesus coming, salvation, power, kingdom, the authority of his Christ. But that when that happens, something occurs with Satan, because it says, because the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down. Okay. And it says, woe, rejoice to the heavens and those who dwell in them, because Satan no longer has access to the heavens, but woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil's come down in great wrath because he knows that his time is short. Okay. That's going to be the great tribulation, is Satan's wrath. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where again she is to be. She is to be nourished. For what? Time, times, and half a time. 3.5 years again. So that lines up. But if you look, when the dragon saw he had been thrown down, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So whatever is happening here, it is not millennia ago, as far as like the beginning of creation. There is an event, there is something that happens with Satan and his angels because of Jesus coming to earth, fulfilling his ministry, establishing salvation, establishing his authority, that then corresponds to Satan and his angels being thrown down to earth and now pursuing the woman, Israel, who had given birth. Okay. Now, some people read that next verse about the two wings of a great eagle being representative of the United States. Because as we already saw when we looked at the beast, the description of the beast in Revelation 13, the animals that are represented in that beast correspond to modern nations. So this could also correspond to a modern nation. And today, the nation whose symbol is the eagle would be the United States. So there are those who believe that when all of this is happening, when the dragon is pursuing Israel, that she's going to be protected by the United States for 3.5 years. We may already be in this 3.5 years. I don't know. What the Lord told me is don't make the mistake of automatically thinking because it's 3.5 years that it's going to be the first 3.5 years of Daniel's final week. So I don't know if this is a distinct 3.5 years. I don't know if it's the 3.5 years that leads up to Daniel's final week. I don't know if they overlap somehow. But based off of current events and the time that this is being taught is when things are happening between Israel and Iran, and the United States is trying to broker peace. There's 3.5 years left in Trump's term. So I'm curious to see things play out, that if this 3.5 years isn't the rest of Trump's term, and that there is a protection and a nourishment of Israel. I don't know if that's going to correspond to the Sixth Trumpet War. I don't know if the Sixth Trumpet War will come at the end of it. I'm not sure how they all are going to end up playing out together, but that's just something that occurred to me, is we might be at the beginning of this particular 3.5 years. We may not. We're going to have to wait and see. But that's just something I wanted to point out because I thought that was quite interesting with all of our current events. Are we at the beginning of the Sixth Trumpet War? Possibly. Let's see what happens. Are we at the beginning of this 3.5 years where the United States is going to protect Israel against the dragon coming at it? Possibly. I mean, what happens if China gets involved and backs Iran? And what's interesting is the animal that symbolizes China is the dragon, the red dragon. They're communist. So I don't know. This is all speculation on my part. I'm going to wait and see. I'm just going to watch what happens and get confirmation about the actual fulfillment of Scripture. So, as I always say, we're going to watch the news and say, that's interesting. This might be this. Let's watch it play out. Let's wait and see. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. I don't know if this is going to be literal water, and maybe this is a natural disaster, flooding, a tsunami, and the actual earth is going to somehow miraculously, protect the people. Or if this is symbolic and the water represents something else, a flood of something else trying to take out Israel. And if the earth represents something else, because we know the beast in the first part of Revelation 13 comes out of the sea, and sea represents peoples, but it also represents chaos. So I believe the Antichrist is going to rise up out of a time of chaos and bring order that is going to be much appreciated by the people at the time. So if that's the case, well, in Revelation 13:11, the second beast, the false prophet, rises out of the earth, and it has two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. So that I believe is going to be the Pope or some other significant religious leader like that, who's going to look like a lamb, but speak like a dragon. And that beast, that false prophet, comes out of the earth. So I don't know if that means something. I don't know if there's going to be some kind of attack that represents kind of like a flood that the dragon is trying to bring to take out Israel, and then maybe the church rises up, something like that. I'm not sure. Again, we're just gonna have to wait and see. Is it a natural disaster and it's the physical earth, or is it symbolic? The flood symbolic as well as the earth, because like I said, the first beast is going to rise up out of chaos, which is what the sea represents. So why wouldn't the second beast rising up out of the earth, why wouldn't the earth represent something too? And if it's going to be the Pope or some other significant religious leader rising up out of the church, so that was just a thought I had. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. And that word in the Greek is sperma, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So if you remember with the 144,000, we already looked at them originally in Revelation 7. They show up again in Revelation 14. And in Revelation 7, it listed out the 12 sons of Israel, because we know the 144,000 is going to be 12,000 from each of the 12 original sons of Israel. And that means that it is genetic, it is sperma, right? It is something in the bloodline. But if you recall, they were sealed on their foreheads. And what Revelation 14 does is elaborates and says that the seal on their foreheads is two names: the Lamb's name, so Yeshua, and his father's name, Yahweh. That's what's written on their foreheads. But if you look at Revelation 12, the sperma, the offspring, keep to the commandments of God, Yahweh, and hold to the testimony of Jesus, Yeshua. So this group that is being spared, or that is being addressed, that the dragon is going to go after specifically, these are Jewish Christians or Messianic Jews. Okay. And Revelation 14 goes on to say, no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. I believe that is speaking to not worshiping false gods, because in the Old Testament, Israel was accused of whoring after other gods. And what that was referring to was worshiping, bowing down to other gods. So these 144,000, who I believe are Messianic Jews, have always been faithful to Yahweh, to Yeshua. They've never bowed down to any other false gods. And it says that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes, and that these have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. And that makes me think of Romans 1 and 2, where it says, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile, right? And so that's what I think it means, is that these Messianic Jews are first fruits. Now, there are some who teach that the 144,000 are those who are already dead in Christ and they come back. I don't see that. In Revelation 7, before the first seals are opened and the four horsemen of the apocalypse are released, it says that they're on the earth and that they're held back from going out until the 144,000 are sealed. And then here it does sound like they've been redeemed. So maybe at this point they are in heaven. I'm not sure, but I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me from Revelation 7 that they are dead and then come back. I think it would be the other way around. I think that they're here and they go through the great tribulation, and then they are then with the Lamb. But what I'm pointing out here is consistently, these are ethnic Jews. They are racially Jewish. They may not know which son of Israel their bloodline links up to, but God does. Okay? So there's a lot of talk about, is this the church? Yes, but it is a specific portion of the church that is being addressed because they have a specific role in the end of days. Messianic Jews, Jewish Christians, God has a purpose for them specifically and uniquely, and also specifically in Jerusalem and Israel. Okay, so that would be a fulfillment of what Paul talks about in Romans 11 about the remnant that God is still keeping, but that through the remnant and by the bringing in the fullness of the Gentiles, there's a mystery about somehow through that Israel will be saved. So we're going to have to watch and see how that plays out. But we need to be praying for our messianic Jewish brothers and sisters, and especially those who are in Israel and there to evangelize and proselytize. We need to be praying for them. But that's who's being talked about right here, that Jewish remnant. They are messianic Jews. So I want to go down a bit of a rabbit trail to continue to tie up loose ends, connect dots, to make sure that our timeline is making sense, not just for end times, but also making sense of these events that are being described or even just referenced within these prophecies. So as I pointed out when we were reading through Revelation 12, both the initial telling of the story in the first 6 verses and then the elaboration of the story in the following verses, I want us to square this up because I don't believe it is talking about Satan's original fall. Okay. I think it is talking about something specific that happened to Satan and his angels during the time of Jesus, either during his ministry or shortly after what happened on the cross. So whatever, whether it was while he was in the grave, when he resurrected, I don't know the exact moment, but there's some insights there there's information there that can give us some insight about what is happening. And I don't think it's Satan's original fall. So I want to kind of square up this timeline and talk about, okay, well, when did Satan originally fall? And if this isn't his fall, what are we talking about here? Just so that we understand, and again, find a continuity all the way from Genesis to Revelation, because it is one overarching story. The Bible doesn't contradict itself. And I know that when I dug into this, it helped me to just feel more at peace, but also for things to connect. And even some verses that didn't previously make sense to me, all of a sudden kind of clicked in and made sense. So what I want to do is take a short pivot over to the question, when did Satan fall and what does that mean for what we're studying here? So there's several ideas about when Satan fell. The first is he fell before Eden, but also before creation. Now, you may not have heard of that one, but the people that I have heard teach on it, or at least share their thoughts, point to the very beginning of our Bible, Genesis 1, 1, and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So, wait a second. If there's nothing here, what's the face of the deep and the face of the waters? What is the Spirit of God hovering over if there's nothing? And what they believe is that what the Spirit of God is hovering over, the face of the deep, the darkness, the void, the face of the waters, that is indicative of maybe either another version of earth or something else that was destroyed when Satan fell, and that the creation story that then follows these verses is God's reset. Okay. It's an interesting theory. Okay. So that's one claim, that Satan fell both before Eden, but even before creation. However, the most commonly held view is that he fell before Eden, but after creation. And I think it's just because it doesn't occur to people that there was something before creation. And in fact, I've even heard people say that it had to be after creation because angels themselves are created beings. However, what I have there is Job 38, 4 through 7, where God is talking to Job and he says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." So, if you're saying after creation because angels are created things, well, then the angels had to have been created before God laid the foundation of the earth, because here he is saying that the morning stars, the sons of God, the angels, were singing and shouting for joy when he started to speak things into existence. So if you're saying it's after creation, well, that doesn't make sense of Job 38. Okay. So angels would have existed before God laid the foundations of the earth. And that's where, okay, so before Eden, but yet somewhere either before creation, maybe in the early parts of creation, before the earth was foundation was laid. I don't know, but it would have been somewhere in there because he's an angel. So he had to have been created. He had to have existed in order to fall, right? But these two options beg the question, why did God let Satan into Eden? If he knew, okay, Satan's fallen, he's fallen to the earth, why was he allowed in Eden? Okay, well, I tend to lean toward option C, that Satan fell in Eden, and that the story of the fall in Genesis 3 isn't just telling the story of Adam and Eve falling. I think it's also telling the story of Satan falling. Because the serpent there, it says Nakash. I don't believe it's a physical snake. I think it's a serpentine spirit, specifically a seraphim. And if you haven't yet watched the teaching I have on the Elohim, please go do so. I go into a lot more detail about that. But it says, the Lord God said to the Nakash, who we know is Satan, because you have done this, right? He caused Adam and Eve to fall. Cursed to you above all livestock, above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. It's a snake. So if we're talking about a physical snake, of course it's going to go on its belly. Like, what does this mean? But if it's not a physical snake, if it's Satan, who was a loyal, faithful seraph, a fiery serpentine angel, who in his temptation of Adam and Eve was himself rebelling, well, then this would make sense that God is now saying, all right, you're now going to be on your belly. You're going to eat the dust of the earth. You're not in good standing anymore with the Lord, right? And the very next verse is the one I keep referencing because this is the proto-evangelium. It's the first gospel message. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring, sperma, and her offspring. Okay. And I talk about this too in that lesson where it has to be Jesus because women don't have sperm. So therefore, her offspring, the only woman who ever supernaturally conceived without the help of a human man, was Mary with Jesus. So that's Jesus, and he's a physical offspring. Well, then wouldn't the Antichrist, the beast, also then be the seed of the Nakash, Satan's offspring? Okay. So this, I believe, I'm inclined to believe that that story is both telling Adam and Eve's fall and Satan's fall at the same time. Okay. There are other passages that many believe describe Satan's fall with more detail. Ezekiel 28 is one of them. So I'm going to read verses 12 to 16. Thus says the Lord God, you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. And then it goes on to list all the precious stones. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from where? From the mountain of God. That's Eden. And I destroyed you, our guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. So to me, again, this backs up that Satan fell in Eden, because here he's saying he was a signet of perfection. He was perfect, full of wisdom, perfect beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Okay. So he was in there, and he was blameless until unrighteousness was found in him, until he sinned. And that's when he was then cast out, cast from the mountain of God. He was put out of Eden just at the same time Adam and Eve were. And that's why when God speaks the consequences of the fall, he speaks to all three of them, because all of them are being put out at the same time. Now, one point that's confusing is here Satan's being called a cherub, but I said he was a seraph, right? Well, I recently, so in that lesson on the Elohim, I don't have this point, because this is a new discovery I had, because I finally purchased myself a English translation of the Septuagint. Well, this is how the Septuagint renders it. From the day you were created, I placed you with the cherub in the holy mountain of God. So he wasn't the cherub. He was placed with the cherub in Eden. And we know there were cherub there because that's who guards the entrance so that they can't get back in. And then it says, because of the abundance of your merchandise, you filled your treasuries with lawlessness. You sinned and were wounded from the mountain of God, and the cherub led you out. Right? So he was escorted out by the cherub. I think this is probably a more accurate rendering, because one, it lacks any point of confusion, because Nakash versus cherub, but also this makes more sense based off of our understanding of Eden. So Satan, when he was created, that's why he was in Eden. He hadn't fallen yet. He was still perfect and blameless and beautiful and all of those things. But then unrighteousness was found in him. He sinned, and that's when he was cast out of the garden and led out of it by the cherub. He himself wasn't the cherub. All right. What's the other passage that talks about his fall? Isaiah 14. I'm going to read verses 12 to 15. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. In the Septuagint, where it says you are cut down to the ground, it says you are crushed into the earth. Okay? So again, this sounds like he was set in the Garden of Eden, which is the holy mountain of God. But in his mind, he was planning on trying to ascend to heaven above the other angels. He's going to have his own throne above all the other angels. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. Okay, that's where the divine council meets. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself. Okay, so this was everything that he was planning, but it didn't work out. Okay, he was cut down to the ground. He was crushed into the earth. Again, isn't this making Genesis 3:14 make more sense about why he was being told he was going to be on his belly and eat dust the rest of the days of his life? Okay. So the question then becomes, okay, so he was kicked out of Eden, kicked off the God's holy mountain. Now, was he cast out of heaven completely? Was he shut out of heaven? Not according to Job. Job 1 starts out telling us that there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. I believe that was a meeting of the divine council. And guess what? Satan came with them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? And Satan says, from going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down on it. So he was on the earth, but he comes up for a visit and a little chat with God. Right? And this is where God famously says, if you considered my servant Job, and Satan says, does he fear you for no reason because you protect him? And so then what does the Lord say? He says, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So what? So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So I believe Satan could not dwell in heaven. He could not dwell in the holy mountain. He could not go back into Eden. He was cast down to the earth. However, he wasn't shut out from heaven, that there was still some accessibility that he could, on occasion, maybe at appointed times, maybe only when the divine council was called. I don't know what those specific circumstances are. In this picture, that's what happened. The divine council got called. He went up there with them. And when God says, "Where'd you come from?" He says, "Going to and fro on the earth, walking up and down on it." But then what does he do? He goes out from the presence of the Lord. He goes back to the earth. And then we know the rest of the story of Job. So even though he was cast out and he fell, he wasn't shut out of heaven at that time. I think that happens when Jesus comes. Luke 10:17-20. When the 72 are sent out, which some translations say 70, I believe 70 is the correct rendering, because 70 would represent the number that were in the divine council, and God's church replaces the divine council, I believe. So when Jesus sent them out in authority and power, and they come back and they said, "Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name," right? Here's Jesus's answer. "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Okay. At first, that seems like an odd thing to say, because they're coming back rejoicing, going, "Lord, did you see what happened? We were able to cast out demons in your name." Like, how weird would it be for Jesus to be like, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven," like referring to the original fall. That's kind of a weird thing. Well, I have there "was watching" in brackets, because the word "saw" can also be translated to "was watching." So another rendering would be, "I was watching Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Well, that changes the whole meaning of it. So what God showed me when I was praying into this passage was, they're coming back excited, right? And they're going, "Jesus, did you see? Did you see what happened? Did you see what we were able to do in your name?" And Jesus wasn't shutting them down. He was celebrating with him. And he said, "Yes, I was watching. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Meaning, when the 72 or the 70 were now able to cast demons out of people in Jesus's name, things were happening in the heavenlies that the disciples couldn't see. They saw demons coming out of people. But what Jesus is saying is, it's bigger than that. Because Satan, this may be the Satan, but remember, Satan just means adversary or accuser. It's a term that refers to all enemy, the whole enemy. So really, Jesus could have said, "I was watching the adversary fall like lightning from heaven." He's confirming it. It's like when my child comes up to me and they do a cartwheel and they're like, "Mama, Mama, did you see? Did you see what I did? I just did a cartwheel." And I'm sitting here going, "Yes, baby, I saw it." Right? I think that's what Jesus is saying. They're like, "The demons are subject." And he goes, "Yes, I saw. I saw the adversary fall like lightning from heaven. And behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, however, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." Doesn't that make a whole lot more sense to read it that way? Because otherwise it's just kind of random. Well, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And he's referring to something that happened thousands and thousands of years prior to this moment, versus, no, he's saying what they were doing was causing the adversary to fall from heaven. Now, is this the moment they were shut out of heaven? I don't know. Because when we look at the passages in Revelation 12, it seems to correspond more to salvation coming and the kingdom being established and all of that. So it could have been this moment. It could have been through his ministry. It could have been at the cross, through the cross, at his resurrection. But we know at some point in Jesus's time on earth, right? Satan was shut out of heaven. That's what's being described in Revelation 12. It is tying together Jesus coming to earth, his time on earth, and him going back up to heaven. That's corresponding with Satan and his angels being told, you can't be up here anymore. There's no more place for you. You are shut out of heaven. You are now stuck to the earth. You can't come back up here. And wouldn't that then explain why it says, and when Satan saw that he had been cast down, he was angry and he pursued the woman with great wrath. He went and made war on her offspring. Doesn't that make a whole lot more sense? That also makes more sense out of why deliverance was a part of the ministry of Christ that he passed on to us, whereas in the Old Testament, we really don't see that. So, what's happening here is through the authority that Christ has given us, but also the finished work of the cross, Satan and his angels being cast out, shut out of heaven. And now they're angry and they know their time is short. So they're going and they're making war on the saints, prevailing against them. They are making war on Israel. They're making war on the offspring. Doesn't that make more sense? Okay. So it's just understanding that powerful, significant shifts happened through what Jesus did on earth, through the cross, through his resurrection. That's what I think Revelation 12 is talking about. Okay. So when it says that the dragon went off after the rest of her offspring, okay, I've already said it's not the church. I'm not advocating for replacement theology. Okay. So here's a summary. It's a synthesis of all that we've studied up to this point to help give us a context for what's happening. We already knew that the beast makes war on the saints and prevails for a time. He prospers until the indignation is accomplished and the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end. Jesus tells us that those who endure to the end will be saved, and he promises that the great tribulation will be cut short for the sake of the elect, and that immediately afterward he comes on the clouds, gathers his elect to himself. So we must remain awake and ready. Revelation 14:12 calls for the endurance of the saints. Revelation 16:15 reminds us to remain awake and dressed with our wedding garments on, because in 17:14, when Jesus is at Armageddon, it says those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Okay, so this is the big picture of the whole church. Okay, but when we talk about the offspring, the church as a whole, and especially Gentile believers, are not the sperma of Israel. We've been grafted into the root that is Israel and have therefore become a part of spiritual Israel, and we get to partake of the promises of Abraham. And that's what Paul writes in Romans 9. And I've been hearing a lot of people quote this passage recently in the debate about what is Israel. What's the real Israel? Is the nation today the same as biblical Israel? What does it mean? What does it mean to support them? Are we commanded in the Bible to support them? And I'm going to post a longer video that I'm going to share my thoughts and my understanding of scripture on that topic. But here, real briefly, I do want to point out a couple of things. Here, like I said, this is one people are quoting a lot lately. It says, but it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all children of Abraham, not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, his sperma. But through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. We are not the sperma of Jacob, Israel. We get counted as such because we've been grafted in, because we are children of the promise. We are children of God because we've been faithful. We are a part of spiritual Israel. Okay. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still true offspring. And like I've been saying, that's the Messianic Jews. Remember that the 144,000 are servants of God, descended from the 12 sons of Israel, Jacob, and they're sealed on their foreheads with the name of Yahweh and the name of Yeshua. They keep the commandments of God and their testimony of Jesus. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They are spiritual virgins, no spiritual adultery with other gods, just like the remnant from the time of Elijah, which Paul also invokes in his discussion about Israel in Romans 11. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars. I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. So what he is saying, right, is that not all of Israel are considered children of God because they are natural branches that have been broken off for unbelief. They rejected Jesus. But there is a remnant that has never been broken off because they have maintained their testimony. They are spiritual virgins. They are natural branches that do abide in the vine and have always abided in the vine. And that's who we're talking about. And that's where we now shift into talking about the two witnesses. Because in Revelation 11, there's gonna be two witnesses in Jerusalem, and we know that they're gonna prophesy and testify to the people there for 3.5 years. Now, this is going to be the first 3.5 years of Daniel's final week, his final 7 years, because when the beast rises to power, he's going to kill the two witnesses. And we know that the beast rises to power 3.5 years in. So if they get to testify and prophesy for 3.5 years and he rises up at the 3.5 year point, and that's when they die, is when he rises up. Clearly, this is all corresponding. The previous set of 3.5 years, where the wings of the eagle protect and nourish Israel for 3.5 years, like I said, I don't want to make the mistake of automatically conflating that it's the same 3.5 years as when the witnesses are prophesying. It could be, but they could also be their own distinct 3.5 years, whether or not there's overlap, whether or not it's the 3.5 years leading up to the final week. We won't know until we continue to see events unfold and confirm the fulfillment of prophecy. But let's talk about these two witnesses, because guess what? They're Messianic Jews. Okay. So that's why there's an important role for this Jewish remnant, the 144,000, the two witnesses. That's who we need to be supporting. Okay. So going back to then Revelation 11, reading about the two witnesses. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Guess what? 3.5 years. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. Again, 3.5 years, clothed in sackcloth. So, what he is talking about, so he's telling John, measure the temple and the altar, not the courts, because the courts are going to be overran by the nations. Some translations say the Gentiles or the heathens. So, these are graphics that I got from a website called Temple Study. And on the left is the original Temple of Solomon, and you can see the temple, and then outside of it is the altar. And those are the two things that God told John to measure, the temple and the altar. Well, that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar when they were taken off to exile. When they were released from exile under King Cyrus, Zerubbabel led the group. You can read about that in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. Zerubbabel led the group that came back, the remnant that came back, and they rebuilt the temple. Again, you see they built the temple and the altar. Now, at the time of Jesus, Herod and others had expanded upon it, adding these outer courts. And so you can see that there's the court of the Gentiles, there's the court of women, there's the court of Israel, right? The priest court. So all these courts surrounding the temple and the altar. And that's what God is telling John, don't measure any of those courts. Just measure the temple and the altar, because all the courts, all they are going to be overrun by heathens, by Gentiles, by the nations. Well, the location of both the Temple of Solomon, the Temple of Zerubbabel, which was expanded and called the Temple of Herod, that was located on what we currently call the Temple Mount. And I got this screenshot from a video from End Time Ministries, which I highly recommend their teachings. That was founded by Irvin Baxter, if you recall the stories I shared in the lesson on the seven trumpets. What they pointed out is that this is the Temple Mount, okay? And it is currently controlled by the Muslims because they went and built holy sites for them on this location. And this is going to be an issue when it comes to the Jews being able to resume animal sacrifices because they're going to need a temple and an altar. When they did a study of this site, what they determined is that the location of the original altar, both the Solomon altar and I believe the Zerubbabel altar, but definitely the Solomon altar, was where that little tiny building that I got circled, where that is. And that's right now called the Dome of the Spirits. And here's a close-up of somebody's trip there, so you can kind of see how big it is based off of how many people fit inside of it. That is where the original altar was. So if they would be able in the peace agreement to get rights to that little building to build an altar, that's the minimum of what they need to resume animal sacrifices. However, what you do with the animal sacrifices, then you then take it into the temple. So they would have to build something, and there's room around it to build a temple. So if they're allowed to put an altar there and then build a temple, there's room there. Okay. But there would not be room to build courts. And that's why God says, leave that out, because it's going to be overrun by who? Heathens, Gentiles, the nations. And that's exactly right. So if that's where the altar gets built and a temple gets built next to it, guess what? The courts are going to be overrun and trampled by Muslims, as well as tourists, as well as right, not the religious Jews. They're going to be instead, the courts are going to be trampled and overrun. So I think that this is probably the angle that will be taken as far as coming up to that peace agreement so that they can have the ability to resume animal sacrifices. Is they're going to be asking for the Dome of the Spirits and then some room, next to it somewhere where there's room to build a temple. And guess what? The claim that they can make, or the argument they can make, is it will not require the demolition of any Muslim holy sites, nor will it impede the Muslims' ability to continue to do their worship there. That instead, the Jews will be able, through this accommodation, to also do their worship right alongside. That there won't be interference, there won't be, any need to demolish anything. So that's the theory I'm inclined to. All right, so continuing on, reading about the two witnesses. Well, in verse 4, it says they're the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. This is a reference to Zechariah 4. And a second time I answered and said to him, so this is Zechariah talking to an angel, what are these two branches of the olive trees, which are beside the two golden pipes from which the golden oil is poured out? So that's right there, two olive trees and two lampstands. And he said to me, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. And then he said, these are the two anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth. Again, the Lord of the earth, Lord of the whole earth. So when it's John is specifically recalling that to tie it to Zechariah 4, because the two witnesses are going to be a fulfillment of Zechariah 4. They're going to be the two anointed ones. Okay. What are they going to do? Well, it says, if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouths and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. Now look at the two powers that they're given and tell me if they don't remind us of stories from the Old Testament. The first one, they have the power to shut the sky that no rain may fall. Elijah did that, right? And they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague. Well, Moses did that. That's why most people believe the two witnesses are going to be Moses and Elijah. First, because these two powers align with what Moses and Elijah were able to do when they were on earth. Also, it's Moses and Elijah who show up at the Transfiguration. They would also represent the law and the prophets. Plus, religious Jews are still awaiting a Messiah, and Moses was the forerunner, the foreshadowing of the Messiah. And still, they annually call for Elijah to come during their Passover Seder. Every single year, at some point, they open the door and they invite Elijah, and they're waiting for Elijah to show up one year. So they're awaiting Moses in the form of a Messiah and Elijah to come. Now, the other possibility that I've heard is Enoch and Elijah, because both stories in the Bible, neither man actually died. They were just taken up to heaven. So that's possible. but I tend to lean toward Moses and Elijah because there's too much evidence, that aligns with Moses and Elijah. Now, I don't believe it's going to be literally Moses and literally Elijah. I think instead it's going to be saints who are coming in the spirit, the anointing, the mantle of Moses and Elijah. And they're going to be prophesying, they're going to be testifying, they're going to be trying to evangelize the Jews. Okay, so again, when it says supporting Israel, we're not talking about the government of Israel. What we're talking about is, one, support your brothers and sisters in Christ, the Messianic Jews who live there. We need to support them. We need to be praying for them. But also, we need to be supporting the ministry of the two witnesses when they come, because we need to be praying for them to come to salvation. Because just like the Lord, we shouldn't want anyone to perish. Then it continues on. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. Okay? And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom in Egypt, right? Think about the correspondence, and also both Jesus and other writings in the New Testament link it to Sodom and to Egypt. And that's where the Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents. They're celebrating because these two prophets have been a torment to them. Well, how's this possible? Well, we now have the advent of the internet. Somebody's going to sit there and live stream the dead bodies on the street for 3.5 days, right? That's how so many people are going to be able to watch it, and how so many people are going to be celebrating it. But guess what? After the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God enters them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. They're going to be resurrected on a live stream, I believe. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched, right? And at that hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake. And the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is soon to come. And if you remember, the second woe is tied to the sixth trumpet war. So I don't know where in the timeline this happens, but this is the second woe is the sixth trumpet war. So that could be, before, during, or after the two witnesses. I don't know. But this is the time of revival. And I think that is what Paul is writing about in Romans 11, when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Because right now there's a partial hardening. There's only the remnant who have achieved salvation, right? Well, the two witnesses, they're Messianic Jews too. They're Jewish believers. They're Jewish Christians. And they're going to be testifying, proselytizing. And I think that also they'll be joined by other Messianic Jews who are already doing that work. So let me summarize what we've talked about so far. We know that the dragon, through the beast, will make war on the saints, and the dragon has been specifically pursuing the Jewish remnant. Israel will be protected and nourished for 3.5 years by the two wings of an eagle, which might be the United States. That could be the first 3.5 years of Daniel's final week, or it could be its own 3.5 years. Like I said, perhaps the 3.5 years leading up to the start of Daniel's final week. We'll have to wait and see. We do know, however, that it is the first 3.5 years of Daniel's final week that the two witnesses will be there. And they're going to have these supernatural abilities that protect them. They're going to be able to prophesy, testify until the beast rises up and kills them. Okay. And we've already talked about the beast. We have its own lesson on the beast, the Antichrist. And so if you haven't watched that, you can go back and get more detail about who I'm talking about, because that's the lesson in which we talked about the first beast as described in the first part of Revelation 13. What we have not yet talked about is the second beast that, as I already pointed out, rises up from the earth, looks like a lamb, speaks like a dragon. Okay. And he's going to be working in concert with the first beast. So now we're talking the false prophet is the second beast. The Antichrist is the first beast. They're going to be working together. This is now the one world government and the one world religion joining forces in order to deceive the nations. And that's what I want to finish up our lesson, is talking about the false prophet and what he's going to be doing once the Antichrist does rise up, kills the two witnesses, puts an end to the daily sacrifices, goes into the new temple, declares himself God, right? All these things we've already studied and talked about. Well, he has somebody who is helping, and that's the false prophet. And that's what I want to dive into. All right, so this first part I already read, but I want to read it in its full context. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. Second beast performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. So, horns, as we already talked about in previous lessons, represent authority. So this lamb, I'm wondering if it, or if the false prophet, if he may not be operating with influence over both Catholics and Protestants, because I think the false prophet is most likely going to be the Pope. So it's going to be someone who looks like a lamb, who has influence over, it says two horns. So I'm wondering if it's going to be influence over both Catholics and Protestants, but it's going to speak like a dragon. It's going to exercise the authority that the dragon gives it. It's going to lead everyone to worship the Antichrist, and it's going to use false signs and wonders in order to convince people. Okay. And we see this confirmed in Revelation 16 that says, "And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet three unclean spirits like frogs, for they are demonic spirits performing signs." So we know that. Well, then 13:2, and to the first beast, the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. And we just read in Revelation 9 that the great dragon is Satan, the devil, Satan. So this is the dynamic, right? The dragon is going to give authority and power to the beast, and the beast then shares it with the false prophet, so that through these demonic spirits, the Antichrist and the false prophet can do false signs and wonders. And Paul attests to this in 2 Thessalonians 2:9, the coming of the lawless one, the Antichrist, is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders. So we see this repeated throughout end times prophecies in different places, both in Revelation, but also Paul confirming it in 2 Thessalonians. So that's who the false prophet is you got the dragon empowering the beast empowering the false prophet, the Antichrist empowering the false prophet, doing false signs and wonders through these demonic spirits that are operating through them. Okay. And it says, by those signs, the false signs that is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath, pneuma, to the image of the beast. Hopefully that is ringing a bell from a previous lesson in which I talked about the difference between pneuma and psyche. And pneuma is used to identify Holy Spirit, human spirit, evil spirits. So when it says it was allowed to give breath, to give pneuma, to give a spirit to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Okay, so image doesn't mean picture. We're not talking about a photograph, right? It can be a carved image, a graven image. It can be a molten image, right? There's a lot of different ways that idols were created in the Old Testament. And they're all called images of some kind, depending upon the material that's used and the manner in which they're worshipped. There is one, though, that this is specifically hearkening back to, and we know this because of the clue about it, one, having a spirit inside of it, and two, speaking. Okay. And that would be the teraphim. Teraphim shows up 15 times in the Old Testament, the word. It often gets translated to household gods or household idols. We see a teraphim in the story in Genesis 31 of Rachel stealing her father's, Laban's teraphim, and him going after her to get it. We see a teraphim used by Michal to trick Saul's soldiers so that David could get away, and that's in 1 Samuel 19. We learn from Ezekiel 21 that Nebuchadnezzar used many forms of divination, and one of the forms listed is consulting a teraphim. Teraphim are described in Zechariah 10:2 as uttering nonsense. Some translations say speaking iniquity. And then during the time of King Josiah, when he did his reforms, and it lists out a bunch of things. He kicked out the mediums, and he kicked out the necromancers, and he tore down the Asherah poles and the altars to Baal. Well, guess what? He also had them put away the teraphim. And the putting away the teraphim is listed right in the midst of getting rid of the mediums and the necromancers. So teraphim specifically were idols, okay, that were used for divination, meaning that they were consulted. And Zechariah even says they uttered or spoke, right? And this aligns with what we know from other sources outside the Bible about this practice among people groups who interacted with the Israelites, who they probably got this practice from. One example is in the book of Jasher 31:43 says, and some make them in the figures of men, the teraphim, of gold and silver, and go to them in times known to them, and the figures receive the influence of the stars, angels, spirits, right? So the figures, the teraphim, receive the influence of some kind of spirit that tells them, the person who's consulting them, future things. And guess what it says? In this manner were the images which Rachel stole from her father. It's a teraphim. Okay. So teraphim were not just hunks of wood that were carved into something and put on someone's mantle. These things were figurines, possibly of ancestors, but they represented divine beings, false gods, and they were consulted. They were used for divination purposes, meaning they're talking to evil spirits. They're trying to get answers. They're trying to find out about the future. They're trying to get guidance on what they should do. Okay? And Revelation 13, going back to that, here's what it goes on to say about this particular thing, modern teraphim. It says that, wait, did I go? Yes. So it has the spirit in it, okay? It can speak, and somehow it can cause those who are not compliant with worshiping the beast to be killed. So I believe this is describing some kind of modern teraphim. And it's going to be in the image or likeness, or at least represent the Antichrist, because that's who's supposed to be worshipped. This thing is going to be able to speak. It's going to be able to monitor and enforce worship. It's going to be possibly capable of killing dissidents. And I think that this is something that we already see technology on its way for. Because don't some of us in our homes have little boxes that talk to us, that we can call out and ask it questions, and it can tell us what to do and get us information? What about people who are already relying on ChatGPT, right? AI. What about people who call out and ask their phone to do stuff for them? So this isn't unheard of. But what this is going to be is next level, where now not only is it going to speak, but what's going to be speaking is going to be demonically empowered. What's going to be speaking is going to be an evil thing. Okay, it's going to be a pneuma that's speaking, but also monitoring. Well, our phones already monitor us. Alexa already monitors us. Our Ring doorbells monitor us. But somehow they're going to be able to report and enforce whether or not we're complying with worshiping the beast. And depending upon what the mark of the beast is, I believe that's also how it can cause people to die. Now, the to be slain, it could be that it's reporting those who aren't worshiping the beast, and then therefore someone comes and arrests them or kills them. But I also wonder if there might not also be technology related to the mark, that, especially if we think about it being like a Neuralink, where if all of a sudden this thing reports you as especially being repeatedly non-compliant, well, if you got some inside your head, they can just push a button and you die. And that's the other piece that the false prophet plays a part in, is the mark. And the false prophet, causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of its name. And it goes on to say the number is 666. So the false prophet will also promote this mark of the beast. And that's going to be required to at least buy and sell things, right? Go to the grocery store, have a business. But I'm thinking it's going to be beyond that. It may be required to be employed. It may be required to have access to banking systems. In order, because especially if they move us to a digital currency, right? It's like, well, where's your mark? Do you have the mark of the beast? Because you can't even access money. You can't be employed. You can't participate in society unless you have this quote unquote mark. I believe it may be something like this neural link that's being developed where they're going to plug our brains into some kind of cloud, into the system. But if you haven't been to a Whole Foods lately, they have the option where you can pay by scanning your palm. Okay. So there's going to be something, whether it's in our hand, our forehead, that's going to be required in order to participate in the marketplace, potentially work, potentially have access to money. And that's what's going to cause a lot of people to cave. That's going to be the reason why people give in, because they cannot trust the Lord to provide for them when their bank account is, they're locked out of their bank account, when they're evicted from their homes, when they can't go to the grocery store, when they are looking at the possibility of themselves starving, or worse, their children starving. This is a reality that I understand evokes fear. But this is why we have time to prepare. And we also have to remember that God provided manna for the Israelites when they wandered the wilderness for 40 years. That God, there's stories of God having ravens coming and feeding people. God can provide. We need to remain faithful. Do not let the risk of losing your job, losing your home, losing money, not being able to go out and shop be a reason to engage in worship of the beast, where you are receiving the teraphim and you're receiving the mark, whatever they may end up being. And you will know exactly what they are because it requires your agreement. You have to take these things. There has to be some element of worship, of compliance, of alignment. Okay. And this isn't going to be a secret because it is something that both the Antichrist and the false prophet are going to be promoting and pushing. And it's going to be in the final 3.5 years before Jesus comes back. So we have time to be ready to have things, but also to work on our faith and to wrap our minds and our hearts and our will around the fact that we're going to have to remain obedient, even to the point of death. Remember, we overcome by the power, by the blood of the Lamb, by the power of our testimony, and not loving our own lives even unto death. And that's something we're going to have to be ready when it comes to our children and our grandchildren as well. It's not going to be easy. That's why it's called the Great Tribulation. That's why Jesus said nothing like this has ever been. And it's for the sake of the elect that it's going to be cut short, because otherwise, who would survive it? So we need to surrender. We need to posture ourselves now. We need to decide now that come what may, I will not take the mark. I will not take this teraphim. I will not participate, even if that means that I have to give up my life, even if that means my family has to suffer. Because we are warned quite harshly, quite directly, what happens for those who do take the mark, who do worship the image of the beast. Revelation 14, 9 through 12. And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. Jesus said those who endure to the end will be saved. Jesus says we're not supposed to fear he who can destroy body, but instead fear the Lord who can destroy body and soul. We are not supposed to fear the enemy. We are not supposed we're supposed to not love our lives even to the point of death. We are supposed to be committed no matter what to him. And right here, it very plainly says, whoever, whoever, anyone who worships the beast in its image, that's the teraphim, receives a mark on his forehead or his hand, will drink the wine of God's wrath. And we're going to learn more about that in our next lesson. So next time we will study the bowls of God's wrath, which will be poured out on all who take the mark of the beast and worship its image. But those of us who endure to the end, who hold to the commandments of God and to the testimony of Jesus, who do not commit spiritual adultery with false gods like the Antichrist, who do not get in bed with Jezebel, the harlot, who we'll learn more about next week as well. Those of us who remain awake and ready, who stay in our wedding garments and keep them clean, those who are called and chosen and faithful, we have nothing to fear. We are children of God. We are not children of wrath. So do not let your hearts be troubled, right? Do not let this be a point of fear. We have plenty of time to prepare. And I'm not saying just stockpiling food or stockpiling things that can be used kind of in an underground market where we can trade things. I'm not talking about being, merely becoming a part of a community where we share resources. Yes, all of those things are good. Community is good. Sharing resources, that is the early church, right? But knowing too that when push comes to shove, either God will provide or we get to go be with him. Okay. Option C is not a viable option because if we give in and we take the mark so that we can get money, so that we can have a job, so that we can go to the Kroger, we drink the full portion of God's wrath and we have no place in heaven with him. So we need to decide now. We need to prepare ourselves, not just in the physical, like I said, with resources, but we need to prepare ourselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So this is what I want to close with. I try to do this every time that we have a lesson that fills in some answers for our timeline. And we know the two witnesses prophesy for 3.5 years. We believe it's the start of the final 7 years. It's in the first 3.5. The United States protects Israel for 3.5 years. Is it the same 3.5 years? We don't know. I could even put that in the leading up to final 7 years column, but we don't know yet. Antichrist makes war on the saints, which includes the Messianic Jews, the Jewish remnant that we talked about today. And also the false prophet. We have all false prophets because Jesus warns us there will be many false prophets, but the false prophet, who I believe is the Pope, he's going to rise. He's going to lead many astray. He's going to perform signs and wonders. He's going to tell the world to worship the Antichrist. He's going to promote a device that's going to monitor and enforce worship. And he's going to tell everyone to take the mark of the beast. So that's our newest additions to our timeline. And of course, I know there's places where we have question marks because again, I think we're getting close. We're getting close to the sixth trumpet war. We're getting, are we already in the time of the United States protecting Israel? I don't know, but that's what we're watching. That's where we're at. And so I'm hoping that by the end of this, we have a good synthesized picture of what is to come based on all the end times prophecies, because that's what we've been working through. And we have 3 more lessons. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the bowls or vials of God's wrath. That we're going to be talking about the harlot. That's going to be our next lesson. And then after that, we're going to have a lesson on Armageddon. And that's where we'll be looking at some of the other verses that I know many people are citing today. I've heard many people say this might be the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog of Magog war. I don't think it is. So when we get to the lesson on Armageddon, I'll explain why. We'll talk about that. We'll be looking at Zechariah 12-14, some of these other passages that I know many people out there talking about current events, things that are happening right now are invoking, and I will share them with you and share my thoughts. And of course, we're going to come to our conclusions together, but each of us can hold it with loose hands because it's going to be what it's going to be. Everybody's going to be right. Everybody's going to be wrong. We just need to use this information to be prepared and ready, not to be legalistic about it. Okay. And definitely use this information to be encouraged, to be prepared. Don't be afraid. Okay. This is not supposed to be something that we are sitting here trembling in dread. Okay. That this is supposed to be something that we are eagerly awaiting because it is Jesus coming back for his bride. And that's what I'm looking forward to. And I hope you're looking forward to it as well. And I hope that you were finding these lessons helpful in accomplishing their purpose, keep helping you to wake up to what is happening and what is coming, feel ready, and know where you need to get more ready than you maybe are right now, to be encouraged, as also to will as to be motivated to continue to share the gospel, continue to share your faith, live out your testimony, because we want as many people to be saved by the time that Jesus comes. And we also now need to add to our list praying for our Messianic Jewish brothers and sisters who are out there, who are proselytizing, who are trying to also bring Israel, the physical offspring of Jacob. We want them to be saved too. We want those natural branches that were broken off for unbelief to be grafted back in, because Paul said it was possible that if they come out of their unbelief, if they stop rejecting Jesus, that they can be grafted in, they can be saved. Because while they may be physical offspring of Israel right now, they're broken off, they're not considered children of the promise, and we don't want that. We want them to be saved just like we want every other person in this planet to be saved. So be praying for those who are on that mission, because it's not an easy one, and as we read today, it's a dangerous one. So that's one way that we can be supporting, is through prayer. So I hope that's helpful. I'm eager to jump into our next lesson. So I hope you join me then.